Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Carnegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the double secret selection committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hello, Don. Great to be here.
So today we have Dr. Frank Butler, who is a retired Navy undersea medical officer and an ophthalmologist who served as a Navy SEAL platoon commander prior to attending medical school. So he spent most of his 26-year career in Navy medicine supporting the special operations community. And he served a 5-year stint as a diving medical research officer at the Navy Experimental Diving Unit in Panama City, Florida, where he actually helped develop many of the diving techniques and procedures that are used by Navy SEALs today.
Frank is rightly credited with founding Tactical Combat Casualty Care, also known as TC3, which has transformed battlefield medical care and is credited with saving thousands of lives. TC3 is now used throughout the U.S. military and throughout much of the world. In today's interview, we talked to Frank about his recent book, Tell Them Yourself, It's Not Your Day to Die, which describes the challenges and improvements TC3 has experienced over the past 3 decades. And as a side note, President Joe Biden awarded Frank the Presidential Citizens Medal during a White House ceremony on January 2nd, just a few weeks after our interview with Frank was conducted. The medal is one of the highest honors a civilian can receive, and it recognized Frank's many contributions to civilian and military trauma care. All of us here at IHMC congratulate Frank for this well-deserved honor. Before we get to our interview with Frank, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all of the wonderful 5-star reviews.
As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review comes from a listener who goes by the moniker April X 6003. In responding to episode 174 with Rudy Tanzi, the reviewer writes, "Once again, a great interview. I love STEM Talk. I would have liked to hear more about the fraud in Alzheimer's research, and also would add that a plant-based diet is not the end-all, be-all for brain health."
Well, thank you, April X 6003, and agree with you on the plant-based diet piece. It seems to be a mantra based on little good evidence. And thank you to all of our other STEM Talk listeners who've helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to today's interview with Dr. Frank Butler.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hi, welcome to STEM Talk. I'm your host, Dawn Carnegas, and joining us today is Frank Butler. Frank, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And also joining us is Ken Ford.
Hello, Don, and hello, Frank.
So, Frank, let's just get started. I understand that you were born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, back in the 50s and 60s. So we want to know, what were you like as a kid?
So I was one of 6 kids in a big, happy Catholic family. Our family has been in Savannah since 1852, so we had a lot of family events and great other families who were good friends, and so we had a lot of those events. As a youngster, I loved to play basketball, so I spent a lot of afternoons and weekends at the local parks playing pickup games. But the other side of my youth was that I also loved to read. So once or twice a week, I would take off on my bike and pedal the 4 miles to the library and come home with a basket full of books. And those would last me for about a week and then repeat.
I used to do the same thing, but I'm not sure it was 4 miles. Those years I was living in Guantanamo, and my dad was in the Navy, and there was a library there, and so you'd have a little basket on your bike, and you'd pedal to the library.
Very nice.
So, although your father was an industrial engineer who went to Georgia Tech, he had a varied career that included becoming director of urban housing for Savannah. And this was a challenging job because the city was just beginning to integrate public housing. So I'm guessing he made quite an impact, didn't he?
So my dad was a special guy. In World War II, he was in a troop ship off the coast of Japan getting ready to go with MacArthur and his invasion force, had it become necessary for us to invade the homeland of Japan. Fortunately, he didn't have to do that, came home and went into business, but then transitioned into being a public servant. He was a perfect person to lead the integration of Savannah's public housing developments, which seems very, you take it for granted now, but it wasn't taken for granted back then. Dad was a big guy, but he didn't have a mean bone in his body. He had a very good way of talking to people and solving problems. So with his leadership, this major transition went very smooth, and he was always a great dad as well.
He sounds great. You mentioned earlier that you came from a large family. Most of them, or many of them, as I understand it, went into the medical field. Is that right?
They did. We have 6 kids in the family, as I mentioned, and the 3 girls were all nurses, and 2 of the 3 brothers were physicians. And then when I went to Georgia Tech, I met this beautiful nursing student named Debbie Kidd on Easter Sunday of my senior year. We were engaged 2 weeks after our first date, and I was lucky enough to wind up marrying her. So now we have 4 nurses in the immediate family. And Debbie and I have been married for 53 years now and have 4 amazing grown children and 14 wonderful grandkids.
I understand during your sophomore year, you went to a Navy SEAL demonstration, and this probably delayed you going into medicine. It was a pretty exciting demonstration. Can you tell us about that?
Right. Well, I went to Georgia Tech on a Navy ROTC scholarship. I had thought I might get a basketball scholarship because I was lucky enough to be a white guy that could jump, and I could also shoot, but I wasn't much of a ball handler, so I didn't get many Division I scholarship offers. So wound up going on a Navy scholarship, and as part of that experience, in the summer, they send you around to look at various aspects of Navy life that you could potentially choose as a career. So in summer of 1969, I was in Little Creek, Virginia. That was the summer of the moon landing. And just before that, we were at a demonstration where a helicopter full of Navy SEALs flew over our group. And as they flew over the water adjacent to where we were, the SEALs all dropped out of the helicopter into the water, which was pretty impressive. And then the demonstration resumed, and about 5 or 10 minutes later, all of a sudden there was a huge explosion on the other side of the inlet. And the SEALs had set explosives and detonated them to simulate clearing a beach for an amphibious landing, which is exactly the way that they did it back in World War II. So I was pretty much sold from the moment I saw that demonstration and determined that going into the SEAL teams was what I wanted to do.
Yeah, that's very cool. So the selection and training program that the Navy SEALs have to go through is quite legendary for how tough it is. And a low percentage of people make it through the basic underwater demolition SEAL school, which is better known as BUDS. So Frank, can you tell us a little bit about your experience going through BUDS?
Well, going through SEAL training, you obviously don't have to have any superpowers, since I made it through. But you do have to have a moderate level of physical preparation. You have to be able to run, swim, do PT, do things like the obstacle course. You don't have to be great at anything, but you can't be really bad at anything or the instructors will drop you from the course. Then beyond that, you just can't ever let the thought of quitting SEAL training enter your head. And I never did. I had no plan B. I had nothing else to fall back on besides SEAL training. And then, of course, last, you have to be lucky. The training is intense. There's lots of rashes and abrasions, and many of the students get cellulitis from infections. They get pneumonia from being in the water all the time, or they just get overuse syndromes and they have to be dropped medically. So a little bit of it is being good, a little bit of it is being stubborn, and a lot of it is being lucky. And fortunately, I was.
Well, I'm not sure about luck. I know that 5 people in your family have become Navy SEALs, so I'm wondering if maybe there's a genetic component to making it through BUDS.
Well, we are an Irish family, so it'd be very easy to call it the luck of the Irish. My cousin Harry was the first SEAL in 1970, and then me the next year, then my brother Pat, and then my son Jeff, and most recently my nephew Sam. So call it luck, call it genes, or just say that we were all too stubborn to quit. Being stubborn is definitely a Butler family trait, and that serves you well in SEAL training.
When you got out of the SEALs in 1975, you had to figure out what to do next. Can you talk about the decision you made and the thinking that went behind that decision?
You know, I'd like to take credit for a really good decision-making process, but I can't remember a time that I thought through the options and said, okay, this is what I'm going to do, go to medical school. It just sort of grew on me after I finished Georgia Tech. And once I got through SEAL training, until you get through the SEAL training, you're 100% focused on that. But by 1973, when I was deploying to Southeast Asia, I had started to lean in that direction, and I actually took a little stack of medical books with me that gave me something to do as we were crossing the Pacific Ocean on a large, very slow amphibious transport ship. And, studying pre-med things also kept me out of trouble when we hit port in various places like Hong Kong and Subic Bay. So I would say about halfway through my time in the SEALs, I was pretty well sold on going to medical school.
So how did you end up in Jacksonville Naval Hospital doing the internship in family medicine?
I loved the idea of family medicine because as a family physician, you get to take care of this great range of things. You can sew people up when they get hurt. You can deliver babies. You can take care of patients with pneumonia, whatever it takes. And internship was a great time of learning and sleeplessness. But often those two things go together.
So after your time as an intern, you were assigned to the Navy Experimental Dive Unit, and at IHMC, we have background working with them. And you described that as a wonderful growth experience. So can you tell us about that experience?
So Don, as you as a leader in diving very much know, the Navy Experimental Diving Unit is a very special place. I had learned to scuba dive as a SEAL, but being assigned to the Navy Experimental Diving Unit was just a whole new approach to diving. There, you don't just follow the rules of Navy diving, you help to make the rules for Navy diving through the research that's done there, and I loved that part of it.
The research there is just so impactful, so we're curious what some of the diving medical research projects were that you worked on while you were at NEDU.
The one that stands out the most, working under the senior medical officer there, who is someone that you knew well back in the day, Captain Ed Thalman, I was the primary investigator on the largest series of in-water oxygen dives that the U.S. Navy has ever done. And that was a challenge because the divers could suffer convulsions or other symptoms, and so there was a great deal of safety precautions, a great deal of care that went into deciding what profiles you were going to test. SEALs like to use oxygen rebreathers because they're small, they're light, and the gas supply lasts for a very long time because you rebreathe all the oxygen that you exhale once the carbon dioxide has been removed. But if you go down too deep, or if you stay for too long, the diver may suffer central nervous system toxicity up to and including full-blown convulsions. So the SEALs at the time wanted to see whether or not the oxygen exposure limits could be extended. Could they dive deeper? Could they go longer? And to test that question meant a lot of fairly high-risk experimental dives. And as the primary investigator, it was a cherished tradition at EDU that if you design the experimental dive program, you do the experimental dives as a diver subject. And I did. So we did almost 900 dives, as I mentioned, and at the end of that, we found that we could extensively revise the Navy's oxygen diving exposure limits and let the SEALs dive deeper and longer than they ever had before.
That had to be very valuable new knowledge.
It was, and it was great to be part of that. And those tables now, so the new tables that we developed were first approved in 1984. And all these years later, those same tables are still in use. So obviously it worked out well, and I was happy to be part of that effort.
You worked some in the emergency room while you were there with the Navy Experimental Dive Unit and started thinking about a surgical specialty, as I understand it. How did you decide on ophthalmology and becoming an eye surgeon?
Right. Well, so working in the emergency room, it's an amazing experience. Knife wounds, gunshot wounds, spinal cord injuries, snake bites, babies being born. You see all of those things. In fact, sometimes you see them all at the same time in the emergency room. But for significant problems, the emergency medicine physician often has to do a handoff to the specialist. And after handing off to the specialist for several years, it occurred to me that I might want to be one of those specialists. And I actually started doing a survey of my friends who were in their training in various specialties at that point, and I got a lot of positive feedback from individuals who had gone into ophthalmology. So I applied for that program up at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda and went up there in 1986 to start my training.
So, Frank, how was your experience as an eye surgery resident in Bethesda?
Again, a tremendous learning experience. I mean, first you have to learn to speak ophthalmology. And for many people, that's just this incredibly arcane language that nobody understands anything about. And that included me when I first arrived there as a resident. So you learn to deal with topics and terms that are not familiar to most physicians. And then you have to learn to overcome the very natural hesitancy to make an incision into somebody's eyeball. That's a little nerve-wracking for the patient. I will tell you it's a little nerve-wracking for the doctor when you first do it. But over the years, as you get better at it, it was just wonderful to be able to take out people's cataracts and have them have that immediate restoration of their vision. They were typically deliriously happy, and it was great to be able to address a disease and see such good and quick results doing cataract surgery.
It's really exciting. And after you finished your eye surgery residency, you were assigned to the Naval Hospital in Pensacola as an ophthalmologist. So how did you wind up being the biomedical research director for the SEALs?
Well, after finishing an eye surgery residency, I was pretty convinced that my adventure doc days were over, and I was going to be in the clinic seeing patients from then on. So one morning in 1989, I was doing just that. I was in the eye clinic seeing patients when I got a call from the XO of the hospital. And he said, "Frank, what are you doing?" And I said, "Sir, I'm seeing patients." He said, "Good. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Now stop and come up to my office." And I remember thinking that kind of invitation never is an indicator of good news. So it turns out that the SEALs had requested me to be moved out to the SEAL headquarters in Coronado, California, which normally would be something I'd be very interested in, but having just learned to do eye surgery and just moved Debbie and the family to Pensacola, it wasn't in the plans from the Butler standpoint at the moment. So the XO said, "If you've got any friends in D.C., you'd better call them because these orders are going to be cut next week." And so I didn't have any friends in D.C., but I had a few friends in San Diego, so I flew out and talked to the admiral out there, Admiral George Worthington and his deputy, Captain Tom Lawson, and it turns out that really what they wanted was to establish a SEAL biomedical research program. And after some discussion, it turned out that they let me do that half-time and continue to see eye patients and do eye surgery in Pensacola half-time. So it was absolutely a spectacular arrangement to be able to pursue both of those opportunities.
That sounds really terrific. And you did that for 14 years. And I've heard you describe it as a dream job. And as Don mentioned and you mentioned, you were the biomedical research director for the Navy SEAL community. And you worked a bunch of projects in that capacity. And we'll mention a few of them here. Now, one of them, very importantly, was related to battlefield trauma care, but we'll dig into that later in the discussion. But other projects included a tactical athlete program, improved treatment of decompression sickness, and the Navy SEAL Nutrition Guide. Since health span resilience and performance is one of our three focus areas here at IHMC, I guess we'd be particularly interested in hearing more about the tactical athlete program at this point.
Right. Well, SEALs and other special operators are absolutely tactical athletes. And a professional athlete, you see all that goes into supporting professional athletes. They have trainers, they have rehab rooms, they have exercise facilities. Back at that time, we didn't have most of those things in the SEAL community, and we needed them. We needed to have trainers. We needed to have rehab facilities. We needed to have weight rooms, better weight rooms. And we needed faster access to surgical care if our SEALs needed that, rather than having to wait 6 months on the typical patient queue to get their procedure done. So we managed to get them up to the head of the line in many cases and to restore them to their units. That went a long way towards increasing the operational readiness that these individuals who were injured were attached to. So that was a big success and is still very, very much a part of the SEAL community now.
And another successful project was the Navy Special Warfare Decompression Computer. And this is a diver-worn computer that you helped design. So for our listeners, can you explain what a decompression computer does for a diver?
So decompression tables tell you how long you can go down and stay at a certain depth before you have to decompress to avoid getting the bends. Decompression computers, on the other hand, let you be at whatever level you want to be for as long as you want to be, and then shift levels and operate at various locations in the water column and take that information, and using its internal software, it computes a customized decompression table for the diver. And for SEALs, when they use the little SEAL submersible vehicles, SDVs. Many of those operations entail very complex dive profiles, so they absolutely needed a decompression computer to help support those operations.
That's a great description, Frank. And it took quite a while for the Navy to officially approve this program. And it also took quite some time and testing to come up with the decompression algorithm and also the hardware for this program, didn't it?
It did. We dove various experimental decompression profiles for the entire time that I was there. That entailed pushing the limits sometimes. Many of the divers got decompression sickness, including yours truly. But we finally got the information that we needed, or thought we needed, at the time, and you will remember this, the diving medicine community was exploring a new way to calculate decompression obligation called probabilistic modeling. And that creates dive calculations that were very safe, but they were also very restrictive. And Navy divers didn't like that at all, and they made that point to the leaders of Navy diving. So the leaders agreed with the fleet divers, and all of a sudden, the research that the Navy had been working on for a decade and millions of dollars spent seemed like it was going to be basically just set aside. However, having worked with Ed Thalman, and at that point being the program manager for the decompression computer, I realized that there was a plan B, which was a specific dive model called VVAL 18, which Ed had worked on for many years at the experimental diving unit. And so I went to the leaders of Navy diving and said, look, if we're not going to do probabilistic decompression modeling, how about we use Captain Thalman's algorithm from the early 80s and put that in the computer? And it sold, and they agreed to that, and so now we had our software for the computer.
That's really interesting, and one can see the value of that. To be honest, Frank, you initiated so many projects during your time as Director of SEAL R&D that we really can't get to them all in this interview. But one of the projects I'd like to mention that's had a really substantial impact was a program to promote refractive surgery. This was a program initially designed to improve combat vision for SEALs. Since its inception, however, your program has been expanded to include essentially all active duty service members, including aviators. Can you talk about the origins of this program and the impact it's had over the years?
This was initiated when I first came to Pensacola in 1989. The Bureau of Medicine and Surgery sent me one of the leaders of SEAL Team 6, who was discovered to have had refractive surgery. And at the time, refractive surgery was absolutely forbidden for anybody in SEALs, Special Forces, aviation, because the incisional technique to do refractive surgery, and the refractive surgery means doing surgery on your cornea such that you eliminate the need for the glasses that many people need. So the challenge to me was, can this person reasonably return to diving? And I spent a week with the individual, and we examined his eye in just about every way possible. And at the end of that period, I recommended that he did be returned to diving status, and he was, and did well. But as part of that, I began to realize that there was a new procedure that was being tested called laser refractive surgery that did not entail many of the adverse effects that incisional refractive surgery did. And it occurred to me that if we could do the right research and prove the benefit of this new technique, that we might be able to convince the SEAL leadership and Navy medical leadership to let SEALs have this procedure and still come into SEAL training. And so we did, working with Captain Steve Shellhorn out in San Diego, a wonderful researcher, former Top Gun pilot. We established a program, did an initial cohort of 50 individuals. The results were spectacular. And we were able to go back and convince the SEAL leadership and the leadership of Navy medicine that this was a good procedure, and they approved it finally in 1996. And now it has gone on every service, every field. I mean, basically, there's almost nobody in the military, in fact, nobody that I can think of, that is not allowed to be in a specific field because they've had laser refractive surgery. So when you consider that about 20 to 30% of our population has a significant refractive error, that is a huge increase in the candidate pool for these special programs.
So tactical combat casualty care, also known as TC3, has been an incredible transformation in battlefield trauma care. And there's good literature that shows that it's saved thousands of lives and is now used throughout the U.S. military and throughout much of the rest of the world. So Frank, your book, Tell Them Yourself, It's Not Your Day to Die, documents how TC3 has evolved over the 3 decades since it was first introduced. And it also describes the trials and tribulations that the program experienced. So can you give us a little bit more background on the book?
Sure. Well, to start from its inception, it's a little bit unusual to have an ophthalmologist delving into an area like this or leading a research effort into an area like this. But the Navy SEALs don't own any hospital ships. They don't own any hospitals. What they do own is corpsmen. And it turns out that of the people who die from wounds sustained in combat, 90% of them die on the battlefield before they ever get to the care of a surgeon. So what corpsmen and medics do for the patients to get them alive to the surgeon is incredibly important. So it became obvious that was something that we needed to look at as part of our research portfolio. And so to make myself a little smarter, I went and became an American College of Surgeons Advanced Trauma Life Support course instructor. And that's pretty much the gold standard for initial trauma care. And I took that, became an instructor, and for about 2 years, I went around to various military bases training different organizations, hospitals, combat units in ATLS.
You mention in the book that as recently as 1992, pre-hospital battlefield trauma care was, except for the fact that you had helicopters instead of horse-drawn carriages, basically the same as it had been during the Civil War. Can you talk about that? That seems amazing.
It was a stunning thing to realize, but I first saw it in print in an article by Navy Captain J.S. Mond that was published around 2000, I think, and he made the statement that battlefield trauma care had not advanced in the over 100 years since the American Civil War. And that paper was written in 1970, I believe. And when I went back and looked at his points, he was correct. And then I realized that pre-hospital battlefield trauma care had not advanced much in the interval between 1970, when he wrote that paper, and 1992, when we were starting to envision this battlefield trauma care research project. So, some specifics. The analgesic that was used to treat casualties' pain at the Battle of Bull Run was IM morphine. At the start of our involvement in Afghanistan, the analgesic that was used to treat casualties' pain was IM morphine. 150 years and no progress. we used plain bandages to cover wounds. These bandages were used in the Civil War, and for that matter, they were used in the Trojan War. So they were not exactly a new concept, and it seemed like we could maybe do better in those. In 2001, most American service members did not go on to the battlefield with tourniquets, and in fact, they were specifically taught not to use them. And then, as a fourth point, if casualties had lost a lot of blood and were in shock, we treated them with electrolyte solution, which we now know not only didn't make them better, it almost certainly made them worse. So there were a few, as we say, opportunities to improve.
Absolutely. I remember the discouragement, in fact, actually an outright ban when I was in the Navy of tourniquets. You were forbidden to use them. It wasn't discouraged. It was an absolute no-no.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's one of the things that, as I traveled around the country teaching people just what you said, not to use tourniquets, as I continued to research that topic, I realized I came across the fact that 7% of the individuals who were killed in Vietnam could have been saved with nothing more than a tourniquet. And when you consider that we lost 46,000 people, 46,000 Americans in Vietnam, if you do the math, that means that over 3,400 people bled to death just because nobody put a tourniquet on them. That's more people than were killed at Pearl Harbor, more people than were killed in 9/11. And yet, in 1992, we were teaching people no tourniquets.
You realized that it was time to rethink what we were doing in battlefield trauma care, but how did you turn that into an actual project? It's one thing to realize something, it's another thing to actualize it and have it persist.
Right. Well, I had focused in on the tourniquet aspect, so I wanted to find someone who would be willing to renegotiate those kind of points. A lot of people don't want to renegotiate the rules. They simply want to follow the rules. But the tourniquet issue was driven home for me when I had a knee operation, and I went to the OR, and after they started an IV, the next thing they did was to put a tourniquet on my leg. And I actually started to protest that, and they could tell I was becoming an annoying patient, so they gave me some more medicine, and I settled down. But the next day, when I went back to talk to my surgeon, I said, Jeff, we teach people not to use tourniquets. The American College of Surgeons says not to use tourniquets, even if you're bleeding to death on the battlefield. And yet, you guys used a tourniquet on me yesterday. And he said, Frank, what can I tell you? We use tourniquets every day in the operating room, and nobody's legs falls off. They're just fine. And so it seemed that this was just an incredible disconnect, and it was going to take somebody with a real academic inquisitiveness and willingness to be flexible to new ideas to undertake this. So after looking around some, the organization that I came up with was the Uniformed Services University, as we say, America's medical school. They had a number of trauma care experts there and had published some papers that indicated that they were willing to question the norms in trauma care.
So, Frank, I'm curious, as the program manager, how did you approach the conduct of the TC3 research project?
Hey, Don, that's a great question. Most people are familiar with the concept of a randomized controlled trial, and they're widely used in medicine and very respected. However, there's no such thing as a randomized controlled trial on the battlefield. So we had to shift to understanding that you needed to use the best available evidence, whatever that was. We took avoiding preventable deaths as our primary metric. There are lots of things you can choose as metrics, and what you choose as a metric often determines the success or lack thereof of your project. But for us, we didn't want a single person who didn't have to die from their wounds. And then after that, we just got together a team of world-class trauma experts and came up with a straw man, if you will. And then I went around for a year showing that to various groups of SEAL corpsmen and Special Forces 18 Delta medics and asking them what they thought. And if you know those communities, you can imagine that they were very upfront about telling me what they thought. And so we worked through all of their concerns as best we could. And once I had redone that, then I sent the paper to 26 physicians, trauma surgeons, general surgeons, thoracic surgeons, emergency medicine people, critical care people, and asked for their comments. And got a lot of input back and went back and rewrote everything again. And so the last thing that we did, and was not necessarily a part of most research efforts like this, is that we incorporated combat medics and corpsmen into the deliberation process. And so it took about 4 years to do that, and the paper was finally published in 1996 in the Journal of Military Medicine.
So even though the TC3 paper came out in 1996, you mentioned in your book that TC3 was not widely used in the U.S. military at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan. Why is that?
Well, yeah, it was definitely a period in which TC3 was more about talk than action. But recall that those 5 years were a peace interval. And so what we did during that peace interval was to discuss TC3 extensively with combat units and at medical conferences all over the country. I got a lot of frequent flyer miles during that period, but the reasons for that were multiple. We wanted to introduce these concepts to units that could use them. We wanted to continue to identify any flaws in the thinking that we had used to construct these guidelines, so it was a two-way street. There was also the opportunity to interact with the senior leadership in military medicine and four-star leaders in combat units to introduce these concepts to them, but nobody really felt a real compulsion to act at the time because we weren't losing any American service members. That all changed after 9/11.
Frank, what was the first unit that stepped up and started using TC3?
The first unit, not surprisingly, because it was started out as our research project, were the Navy SEALs. In April of 1997, Rear Admiral Tom Richards was the commander of the Naval Special Warfare Command, the leader of the SEAL community, and he signed a directive that mandated TC3 as the standard for battlefield trauma care in our SEAL community. And the implications of that are truly important because this was a medical decision, and yet it was being made by a SEAL flag officer. True enough, with the advice of his medical staff, but still, the actual decision was made by a line commander. And that's been true over the years and is an important part of understanding how we operationalize new medical techniques for the battlefield.
So what other units followed in being early adopters of TC3?
The next unit was the 75th Ranger Regiment. I met Major Russ Coatwall when I was doing a TC3 seminar at the American Academy of Military Family Physicians, and he was excited about the concepts and wanted me to come to Fort Benning and present to the medical and line leadership there, which I did, and they liked it and convinced their leadership that they should adopt TC3 as well. And General McChrystal, who at the time was the colonel at the Ranger Regiment, went one step further. He didn't just endorse it. He made it one of the big five, which was his judgment as to what things you absolutely had to be able to master to be a full-up Ranger. And so the Rangers are a great model for how to do this well and thoroughly. Their training, their rehearsals, their documentation was just superb. The other unit that was an early adopter, and just about that time frame, was Delta. I had the opportunity to go to Delta and sit down with a room full of their medical staff and also their line commanders, some of their senior NCOs and some of their senior leaders in the unit came. And it was a very long 4 hours because these guys were taking nothing that you said for granted. So a lot of ideas were challenged and there was a lot of back and forth. So I thought maybe at the end of the conversation that it hadn't gone that well, but the deputy came up to me afterwards and said, "Hey, Doc, I think you just changed the way that we do business here," which was incredibly encouraging coming from that group. The other community that was a very early adopter was the Air Force Special Operations community. Everybody knows the PJs, and they were very early adopters. And there were a few selected conventional units in the Army and the Marine Corps who really, as a unit initiative, said, "Hey, this looks right to us, and we're going to do it." So there were scattered units in the U.S. military when 9/11 happened who had TC3 on board, but the vast majority had no idea what TC3 stood for.
So, Frank, after the results of the Holcomb study from the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research, how did you implement TC3 throughout the special operations community?
Right. Well, to take one step back, so I did a deployment to Afghanistan with a joint counterterrorist task force and had a chance to see TC3 in action there. I saw one of our very trusted partner force colleagues bleed to death from a leg wound because he didn't have a tourniquet. I wasn't there. He was in another location, but by the time I got there on the helicopter, he was dead. So that reinforced the rightness of what we were doing. When I came back from Afghanistan, I got the chance to be the command surgeon for the U.S. Special Operations Command. So off I went to Tampa. And when I got there, I looked around in the office and asked two questions. How many of our special operators have been killed to date? And again, this was 2004. How many people have been killed? And second, what did they die of? And could their deaths have been prevented? Nobody knew that answer, which was unacceptable. So I called my friend Colonel John Holcomb, who was by that time the commander of the Army Institute of Surgical Research, and told him what we needed, which was a preventable death review of every single fatality that we had had in the special operations community up to that point in time in the wars. And he put together a team to do that. Trauma surgeons, forensic pathologists, combat medics, operational medical officers. We looked at all 82 fatalities and determined that 70 of them, their deaths could not have been prevented. Think of a helicopter that blows up in the air. So physicians and medics can't intervene in those situations. You're in the hand of God when that happens. But there were 12 people that we looked at in the study and realized that they could have been saved with better pre-hospital trauma care and faster transport to the hospital. So this was completely new information at the U.S. Special Operations Command. And my staff and I went up and briefed the commander, General Doug Brown, and the deputy commander, Vice Admiral Eric Olson, and told them what we had found and showed them pictures of our passed away special operators and said, "Sir, these operators didn't have to die, and we can prevent other people from dying the same kind of deaths." And that gave us a chance to explain to them how TC3 would have prevented these deaths. And they were very supportive, very accepting, and we were able to secure $7 million to come up with a program called the Tactical Combat Casualty Care Transition Initiative that was set up to fast-track TC3 training and equipment to deploying special ops units. So SEAL units mostly had the equipment, but if you were in a special forces unit that had not adopted tourniquets, the ISR performers would identify who was going next from the special forces teams, contact them, find out what equipment that they needed. They'd obtain the equipment, deliver it to the Special Forces group, and then go do the training. It was just an amazing bit of organization carried out by Colonel Holcomb and led by Sergeant First Class Dom Graydonis, who was a Special Forces medic and had a great deal of credibility in that community.
You mentioned that some units did particularly well and quick at adopting TC3, and I'm sure others were slower. How does the operational leader's priority or lack of priority on TC3 affect the operational units? Does the leader's advocacy for this and passion for it really drive it?
Ken, great question. And to be honest, if you are a colonel leading the Ranger Regiment, if you're a senior medic and your battalion or regimental surgeon don't come into your office and say, "Sir, I have something I need to show you," you're not going to have any visibility of this awareness or of this topic. You have to be very well informed by your medical staff, and they have to be informed by knowing that they are going to be responsible for troops injured in combat and looking around to decide for themselves what the best way to treat these individuals is. And if the unit staff decides that TC3 is the best way to care for these injured soldiers, then they go present that to their command, but it's the commander who has to say, yes, do the training, yes, buy the gear. So without support from the person in charge of the unit, it really doesn't happen.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
You know, you've talked about how TC3 was introduced into the special operation organizations and the special forces. Could you talk about TC3 and the rest of the military? It's not always known to be a highly flexible organization.
Absolutely. Well, so the first part of how that happened, we would have had to do just for special operations because we had a brand new set of operating guidelines. The first thing you have to do is to convince yourself either that you're doing the right thing or discover that you're not doing the right thing and then figure out how to fix it. So you have to monitor very closely the results of these new concepts as they were being used on the battlefield. So how do you do that? Well, you talk to medics and to physicians as they're coming back from the war and ask them, how well did tourniquets work? How well did hemostatic dressings work? And then you take that information and you make the necessary adjustments. As it turned out, the news was almost 100% positive. So then the next step is to message that. You know, we instantly became aware of the fact that if we were saving more lives in the special operations community, we had an ethical obligation to make this news available to people in the conventional Marine Corps, people in the 82nd Airborne. Everybody in the U.S. military needed this information. And so it was a combination of publishing papers and personal trips to combat units and speaking at medical conferences like the Wilderness Medical Society, like the Special Operations Medical Association. You had to get the message out there. You had to let people challenge it and show them the evidence. And if you consider that Special Ops first began to truly implement this in 2005, it's fair to say that 2005 to 2008 was a period of transition, but by 2008, basically everybody in the U.S. military had tourniquets and hemostatic dressings when they went onto the battlefield and knew how to use them.
That's wonderful, and I'm happy that happened.
Yes, it's absolutely incredible impact.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
And after you helped to implement TC3, how did you update recommendations as new evidence from the war and even other sources began to come in?
So, when the original project was being done, it entailed identifying papers that had been written on all of the different journals on trauma care. And bear in mind that this was all done before PubMed. So researching things back in the day was much more challenging than getting on PubMed and looking up papers that way. So it was an intense effort, and we realized that it needed to be an ongoing thing. If you think about medicine, heart attack treatments are not static. Treatment for cancer is not static. Advances are made, and if you are going to keep up with the best practice standards, you have to continually review the information that becomes available over time and decide which of those elements of new information you should incorporate into the TC3 guidelines and which ones you shouldn't. One of the things that is true in something like battlefield trauma care is that there are many, many people who try to sell you many, many things, and trying to figure out not just what works, but what is going to assist you as the medic in caring for your patient is a challenge. And so we realized we needed a standing committee, which we envisioned as the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care. So the first thing we had to do was get funding for the committee, which took me 5 years to figure out, but we finally did in 2001. And then we had difficulty finding a research organization that wanted to have ownership of that kind of enterprise, because obviously you're going to be engaged in a bit of controversy if you are constantly recommending changes to battlefield trauma care. As you said before, the military is not the most flexible organization in the world, but if you approach the military system correctly with the right people and the right information, you can make it work. And our job was to put together a committee composed of those people. So we had the world's best trauma experts, surgeons, emergency medicine physicians, and again, combat medics, the people who are actually going to have to use TC3 on the battlefield. And if they didn't like a proposal, they were not shy about standing up and saying, hey, this is not going to work, and here's why. So by 2001, we had it funded. We actually found a command at the Navy base here in Pensacola that was willing to take ownership of this enterprise. The Navy Operational Medical Institute at the time, Captain Steve Gibner and Captain Doug Freer really stepped up, and I don't think this committee ever would have happened without both of those individuals.
What are we've been talking about TC3 and what an advance it was with respect to battlefield trauma care. And we talked about a few of the new ideas. We talked about tourniquets, for example, which, as we said, were absolutely forbidden previously. Could you tell us about a few of the other advances that it brought to the table that really weren't in use prior to TC3 on the battlefield?
Sure. Maybe from a large perspective, or from an overview perspective, one of the most important things was to understand that battlefield trauma care has to be a combination of good medicine and good tactics. Yes, you're there to treat the casualties, but you're also there to complete the mission, and you're also there to prevent other casualties. So by putting medical care in a good tactical context, you enable the mission to succeed where it otherwise might have failed. And one of the great examples of this is in the Tactical Advantage chapter in the TC3 book. It tells the story of SEAL Master Chief Ed Byers and his Congressional Medal of Honor action. They went into a house in Afghanistan to rescue a hostage that was being held by the Taliban. And as they went through the door, the lead person in the column was shot in the head. So Master Chief Byers was a corpsman. Some people might think that the right thing for a corpsman to do would be to stop the assault, kneel down, and take care of his teammate who'd just been shot in the head. That would have been absolutely the wrong thing to do, and would have resulted in Byers and the hostage and probably some of his teammates getting killed. So Master Chief Byers did what TC3 trains them to do, which is to bring the gunfight to a successful close, and once that has happened, then you have time to treat the casualties. So we call that the tactical advantage, and that's huge. Tourniquets has had a huge impact. I think that is right up there as a life-saving advance. Likewise, hemostatic dressings. If you get shot in the groin, say, and get hit in the femoral artery, you're not going to get a tourniquet on that location, but you can stop the bleeding. We have dressings now that are not the plain gauze dressings that were used in the Trojan War. They are dressings that are impregnated with hemostatic adjuncts, sometimes kaolin, sometimes chitosan. And what these hemostatic chemicals do is to help to clot the blood. It's not just the pressure, not just the bandage, but the chemical in the dressing that helps to clot the blood. And that saved many, many lives. Prehospital fluid resuscitation with blood instead of electrolyte solutions. Paper after paper after paper is showing that if you get shot somewhere, you're in a place that the medic can't stop the bleeding, say, for example, the liver. A medic can't stop liver bleeding, but if he is able to replace the blood loss with fresh blood, and of course we use universal donor blood, it's type O, low titer, so that you can safely give a bag of blood that the corpsman carries to anybody in the unit because it's universal donor. And we're understanding more and more that using that as quickly as possible can be life-saving. And some wonderful papers by Colonel Stacy Shackelford and Colonel Jennifer Gurney have documented that. Every month there's additional papers that reinforce that point. So pre-hospital blood and pre-hospital blood given as soon as possible is a huge advance and will save many, many lives in the future.
So some TC3 innovations, like carrying whole blood on the battlefield, have saved lives. And yet, this hasn't really scaled to the whole military. I'm aware of units that still don't do it. And in the civilian world, many first responders don't carry whole blood, though some are starting to. And, I've heard various reasons for it in the civilian world having to do with reimbursement usually. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us more about that, both in the military world and in the civilian world? I would think if it was ubiquitous, really ubiquitous in the military world, the availability would be better. It might just become a standard of practice.
A great illustration of how this process works is the tourniquet story, and we'll come back to whole blood in a second. But I mentioned that by 2008, every American serviceman or woman, when they went onto the battlefield, had a tourniquet and hemostatic dressing. There was a paper that came out written by Dr. Tess Goodwin in 2013 or 2014, where she examined pre-hospital data from the years 2008 and 2009. And in several million EMS activations, the total number of tourniquet applications throughout the entire United States was exactly 0. This was after we'd been at war for 7 years and everybody in the military had a tourniquet. So why is that? I think the answer is that to make these kind of advances, there is an innovation risk. It takes money, it takes time, you put your professional credibility on the line, and not everybody is willing to stand up and take that advocacy position. So in 2008, that started to turn a little bit. We had people like John Holcomb, Brian Eastridge, Warren Dorlack, Don Jenkins, who were trauma leaders, get out of the military and take over trauma systems in the civilian setting. So all of a sudden, Texas Memorial Hospital in Houston has pre-hospital tourniquets, thanks to John Holcomb. The Mayo Clinic had pre-hospital tourniquets, thanks to Don Jenkins. So we started making some incursions that way. And then the tactical law enforcement community became very pro-tourniquet and pro-TC3 because we'd made an effort to reach out to the tactical law enforcement group because the military feels very close to that group. They protect and serve at home. And so people like Mike Mioli in San Diego, Ray Casillas in Los Angeles, Ralph Cruz in Chicago, they saved many lives in those communities by being the person who is willing to stand up and say, hey, we need to do this. Still, tourniquets were really underused up until 2013. And that happened because of what happened at Sandy Hook. If you remember that horrific shooting, in my mind, maybe second only to the Las Vegas Mandalay Bay shootings, is the most horrific mass shooting incident we've had. 26 first graders killed. The governor of Connecticut asked trauma surgeon Linworth Jacobs to come take a look at these autopsies and to see what could have been done to improve their care. And Dr. Jacobs, who's an incredibly experienced trauma surgeon, said it was the worst experience of his life, looking at the autopsies on those 5- and 6-year-old kids. But he did come away with the realization that that particular killer had made sure that he shot the kids in a place that would be guaranteed to be lethal. So you couldn't really have saved many of those children at Sandy Hook. But he put together a group to start to examine how we could save others in future mass shooting incidents. And that group became known as the Hartford Consensus. It included trauma surgeons, the FBI, the fire community, tactical law enforcement community. Alex Eastman, who was then the SWAT team medical leader in Dallas, now is the medical director for border protection. It was a good group, and they weren't afraid to take a stand. And when we got through talking for about 4 or 5 meetings, what they came out with was that not just medics should have tourniquets and hemostatic dressings, but law enforcement officers, firemen, anybody that is in a situation where they might encounter a patient who's been hurt and needs to have external bleeding stopped. It's very easy to train a first responder to do that effectively. So Dr. Jacobs was a regent of the American College of Surgeons and went to the American College of Surgeons and said, look, we need to promote this as a strong advocacy program. He did the same thing with the White House. And lo and behold, we now have the Stop the Bleed program, which is advertised everywhere, and it's wonderful to see. You can't tell where you're going to need a tourniquet. We've had 2 lives saved in Pensacola just in the last few months. One of those young kids that was attacked by a shark, and then another episode that happened outside the Floribama. Individuals were hurt, and the people there were savvy enough to have tourniquets and save their lives.
So, in addition to tourniquets and whole blood, what are some advances in pre-hospital trauma care that were pioneered by TC3 and are now being used widely in the civilian world?
Well, let's talk about intraosseous access. So, for years and years, you heard about start an IV, start an IV, start an IV. Well, if it's night and it's dark and you are a medic who doesn't start a lot of IVs every day, it can be hard to start an IV. And so at one of our meetings, we had a ranger medic named Rob Miller walk in and take an intraosseous device, slap it on the table, and say, hey guys, how come we're not using these? We use them for kids. We can absolutely use them for adults. And yet, essentially, nobody in the country or the military was doing that. And so we looked at it for a couple of months and decided he was 100% right. So we started to advocate for intraosseous access. What that means is rather than struggling trying to start an IV on a patient that needs blood right now, you can use an intraosseous device and have pretty guaranteed access within 60 seconds of the time that you realize that you want it. And now every medic in the military has an intraosseous device. That's very much catching on in the civilian sector as well, and you see lots of papers comparing IVs and IOs about how quickly they work and how reliable they are, but the point is IOs also are all over the place. The second thing that we should talk about is tranexamic acid. So this is something that was invented back in the 1960s to help women with menorrhagia, very heavy periods. In that context, the women take it orally and it works very well and it's FDA approved and it helps them with their problem. An investigator named Ian Roberts in the UK some years back said, if it works for bleeding, that setting, why wouldn't it work for people who've been injured and are now bleeding? And long story short, it does work. And several very large studies demonstrated that. So now, we mentioned before, Corman faced with a gunshot wound to the liver that he couldn't get access to stop the bleeding. Now he has something that can help stop the bleeding. It's given IV, and it does promote clotting, and he can successfully intervene in someone whose bleeding is internal. That I will say that it came from the UK, and we were very happy to steal that idea from them in 2012. And so beginning in 2012, TC3 has been using it in the military extensively. In the civilian sector, it's being used more and more and more, but I would say that probably less than 50% of the EMS systems now use tranexamic acid. And this is one of those cases where there actually are randomized control studies that say that it works, and yet some people, for whatever reason, are slow to adopt.
Let's talk about ketamine a little bit. Interesting substance. And as you've noted, the U.S. military has turned to using ketamine, as have other militaries like the Israelis, the Germans, the British. But again, it seems like it's been slow moving into the civilian sector as a medication for pain relief. That's the context I'm talking about.
Right.
Could you give us your thoughts on ketamine in the context of pain relief?
Sure. So ketamine was approved by the FDA many years ago as an anesthetic and is still approved for that use. But emergency medicine physicians have known for many years that ketamine is invaluable if you are confronted with a struggling child and you need to do a procedure for them. If you give them a little ketamine, not only does it make the procedure not hurt, but it settles them down a little bit so that you can treat them effectively. So why weren't we using it in the military at the start of Afghanistan? I don't know. It came to our attention again in 2012. The Joint Trauma System and the Committee on TC3 and the U.S. Central Command did a tour to do a survey of pre-hospital trauma care in Afghanistan. So the team, we flew to multiple locations all over that country. And as we talked to the pararescue people in Helmand Province, Camp Bastion, we saw that they were using a lot of ketamine and had a great experience with it. And it turns out that they related to us that they had picked that up from the Brits. So we can't take credit for inventing that and passing it on to the Brits. In fact, just the opposite. But again, we're in the marketplace of good ideas. And if we see something that the Brits are doing that seems to work well, then we should start doing it. So an Air Force Special Operations physician named John Gandy took the point for that. Very controversial at the time. We briefed it to the Defense Health Board. Ketamine is known to be an abuse drug, and it is. Basically, anything that can relieve pain can be an abuse drug. Well, anything that can alter sensorium can be an abuse drug. There's not a lot of Tylenol abuse, but ketamine certainly can alter your sensorium. And so there was a little bit of a negative inclination towards ketamine when we first started showing it around. But why is it good? It's good because it's not an opioid. I mean, we're in the middle of an opioid crisis. We have 100,000 people die every year in this country from fentanyl and other opioid overdoses. We badly need something that can stop pain and yet not cause the bad side effects that opioids do. So on the battlefield, we're not worried about overdose so much, but if somebody is shot and in shock, we don't want to give them an opioid because that will drop their blood pressure and perhaps kill them. So ketamine doesn't drop your blood pressure and is an ideal thing to use. So we made that recommendation in 2012, and it is completely taken over in the military. It's used all the time. The medics love it. The patients love it. In the civilian sector, again, we needed a leader, somebody who was willing to stand up and say, we need to look at this for our patients. And Captain Meg Moore, who is a reserve physician, she's a trauma surgeon. She wrote a paper that came out several years ago that was a joint position paper of the American College of Surgeons Committee on Trauma, the Association of the American College of Emergency Physicians, NAEMT, the EMT Association. All of them agreed that ketamine was a good option, especially for patients who had pulmonary or hemodynamic compromise. And so that made a big impact, and ketamine also is being used more and more. But I would say, again, somewhere less than 50% of civilian EMS units are doing this. But in 5 or 10 years, I bet it will be most civilian EMS units.
Yeah, that'd be great. For listeners who are interested in learning more about ketamine, I highly encourage you to check out our interview with Dr. Jonathan Edwards. It was episode 165. Dr. Edwards is an anesthesiologist, and he's written some books about ketamine, particularly in the context of suicide. And he's a good fellow.
You know, just as a follow-up, the TC3 committee follows the literature on all of the things that we recommend. And as I follow the literature on ketamine, Ken, there are every month more and more papers on ketamine being used to treat suicidal ideation and treatment-resistant depression. So this is something that, in a perfect world, the American people would have access to as a good new treatment for two very bad disorders. But in the real world that we live in, somebody has to fund the trials necessary for those to be approved by the FDA for these new indications. Otherwise, if you have somebody that's suicidal and you take them someplace where they get a ketamine infusion treatment and it relieves their suicidal tendency, it saves their life, but insurance might well not pay for it because that is a medication being used for a non-indicated condition, which a lot of people will tell you is bad. I would say the suicidal patient will probably tell you it's good. But, yeah.
Yeah, it's fact-heavily. A great number of folks, as you know, transitioning in particular out of the special operations community are getting treatments that are not reimbursed because they need them.
Right. Suicide is a terrible thing in the U.S. military. There's a lot of it out there. We're beginning to understand that a lot of the people that we think have PTSD and suicidal ideation as a psychiatric reaction to the horrific images of war, we're starting to rethink that. And you and I looked at that paper that I sent you recently, chronic brain trauma, as in high-speed boat operations, as in firing a mortar for a week or so. Not enough to knock you out, but enough to hit your brain with a blast wave over and over and over. That can cause damage, and that damage can cause symptoms of PTSD. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that there's a tie-in between TBI and causing organic symptoms, not psychiatric symptoms, but organic symptoms. And if we can treat suicidal ideation with ketamine, we should do that.
Agreed. And in support of that, you see football players with CTE frequently committing suicide,
right,
and they were not subject to war.
Right.
And so there's something going on there beyond the psychiatric effects.
Right. And this is emerging in the neuropathology literature. They are able to identify specific types of damage in the brain that are associated with both blunt head trauma and, interestingly, blast head trauma. So if you get hit in the head in a fight, it's not necessarily exactly the same insult to your brain as if you're exposed to a large overpressure from a nearby blast.
Right. One is an impact, and one is essentially reshaping the brain temporarily. So we've talked about the advances that TC3 pioneered and how they have reduced preventable deaths among combat casualties to unprecedented lows. And, we've discussed how TC3 has moved to some extent into the entire military, and it's having a good effect there. So now that it's moved broadly into the whole military, not just in special operations, what level of TC3 proficiency should every service member have versus the skilled combat providers you might find in the unit or on a SEAL team? In other words, are there different levels or tiers of required competence?
Right. It was a very good step in 2018 when, the military, many people consider to be a large monolithic organization. That's not exactly true. There are definitely the armed services and sub-factions within those that have very different perspectives. And just because the Army does something doesn't mean the Marines are going to do it, and vice versa. So unless something comes out of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, it doesn't necessarily get incorporated into the military as a whole. But in 2018, the Pentagon did take that step at the level of the Secretary of Defense and said, hey, U.S. military, everybody is going to get TC3 training. And it's been a mandate since then, but there's an appreciation of the fact that, let's say you're in a Ranger platoon, every Ranger person doesn't need to have combat medic level skills. But there are some things that are easy to do and quick to train that they all should be trained to do. And we call that an all service member level. And that's basically putting on a tourniquet, applying hemostatic dressings, knowing how to open the airway for trauma patients. So those are the basics. And everybody in the U.S. military presumably knows those now. The third tier is a combat medic where they go through a year of training, depending on what service they're in, and they learn about TXA, about giving narcotics, about fusing blood, and that is a much more advanced level. That's Tier 3. And then in between the all service members and the Tier 3, you have what we call combat lifesavers who are trained to do some additional things. So those are the first three tiers. And then the last tier is Tier 4. That would be, say, a battalion surgeon at a aid station. He or she may be able to do a number of additional procedures that a combat medic wouldn't. So it's a very carefully thought out distinction. We're careful about saying, what can we reasonably train everybody in the military to do? What can we reasonably train combat medics to do? And trying to make the matrix, it's called the TC3 skill set, and we identify exactly what skills you need for each of those levels of provider.
That makes perfect sense. Looking at Ukraine right now, we in the U.S. often seem to presume air superiority at all times. That may be an incorrect assumption at some point, but in Ukraine, it's definitely the case. So what's happening in Ukraine with respect to combat casualty care?
What you said about the difficulty in evacuation looms very large, not just for the Ukrainians, but for the U.S. If we find ourselves in a battle against an enemy where there are relatively fixed positions, and both sides now could have drones, and those drones could completely disrupt the evacuation of casualties from the battlefield. So that's what we're seeing in Ukraine. And I've been over to work with the Ukrainians, as has Dr. John Holcomb and Dr. Warren Dorlak, are the leaders of the U.S. military Ukrainian medical assist. One of the big things that we're dealing with right now is rethinking how we use tourniquets. I can put a tourniquet on Ken's leg right now for an hour, he's going to be fine. If I put a tourniquet on Ken's leg for 8 hours, he's not going to be fine. And in Ukraine, sometimes the tourniquets are staying on for that long and causing not just the leg to be amputated, but causing them to have metabolic derangements when all that ischemic blood comes back to the central circulation when the tourniquet is removed. So better understanding when to put a tourniquet on. I mean, in Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. military overused tourniquets, as does the U.S. civilian population. But it hasn't caused a problem because typically the tourniquets are able to be removed in under an hour, in which case they won't cause a problem. But again, if they're on for a long time, now we have to rethink, did this extremity need a tourniquet to start with? And if it did need a tourniquet, okay, we've stopped the bleeding. Now we're an hour out. Is there any way that we can continue to have the bleeding controlled, but take the tourniquet off? So tourniquet conversion is becoming a topic of much greater focus, and we're making some good strides at getting better at that because of the Ukrainian experience.
Yeah, that struck me pretty strongly when I was thinking about drones and lack of air superiority.
If you get shot at 10 o'clock in the morning, they may not be able to evacuate you out until that night because they don't want, if you go out into the open, the drones will see you and come and kill you. So they wait until nighttime, and oftentimes they don't want to put a helicopter into the air, even at night, so they may send a Jeep or a truck to come get you and drive you back 50 miles to wherever the nearest hospital is. That really increases the risk of dying from your wounds.
So, Frank, looping back to your book, what gave you the idea to write this book about TC3?
After having worked on this along with 400 or 500 of my closest friends for the last 30 years, and seeing the progress that we've made, I realize that this is a story that absolutely needs to be documented. When medical publications come out, and you as a consumer of scientific and medical articles will know this, they tend to focus on one thing, say tourniquets. But where can you go somewhere and find the entire story of TC3 with all of the innovations from start to finish? There wasn't something like that as of 4 years ago. And I realized that there needed to be something like that. So I teamed up with my friend Kevin O'Connor, who was the Delta surgeon back at the start of the Committee on TC3. He was one of the early innovators in battlefield analgesia and battlefield antibiotics. And my son Jeff, to get this story in print. We had to go through the entire dialogue of how it started, how we figured out what needed to be changed, and then how we sold it to the different units, and then how we were able to evaluate the evidence as it came in to make sure we were right. And two things that the book highlights, I think, are incredibly important. The first that I heard back from the success of TC3 in combat, I was in Washington on a trip one night in 2002, and I get a phone call at 2:30 in the morning. And I answer the phone, and it was Kevin O'Connor. And he said, "Hey, Frank, did I wake you up?" I said, "Yeah, Kevin, you woke me up." It's 2:30 in the morning. He said, "I just want to tell you that we just got back from Afghanistan on our first deployment. All of those TC3 things that we learned, they work, and they saved a number of lives." He said, "I'm calling you at 2:30 in the morning because I want you to always remember this phone call." And indeed, I have. So the other thing that I think the book covers that is so important is to get the best possible picture of the success of TC3, you have to do a preventable death analysis for the entire fatality cohort in a conflict. And my friend Brian Eastridge did that, and the paper was published in 2012. He looked at all 4,956 fatalities that our country had suffered in the war up to that point in time and said, could this death have been prevented, or was the death inevitable given the wounds sustained? And when he did that, he found that 25% of the deaths in this recent war could have been prevented if we'd been able to do the absolute best thing for the casualty. And many of those happened before TC3 became widespread. So in many instances, the deaths were, there were 1,000 deaths. 200 of those deaths were found to be from just not having a tourniquet. 200 people dying from not having a tourniquet just a few years back. That shouldn't be happening. And then you see other papers, such as the one written by Russ Coatwall and his colleagues from the Ranger Regiment, where they detailed that after starting early with TC3 and training it well and sustaining it well, they reported 0 preventable casualties in the pre-hospital setting. So that's an absolutely stunning and unprecedented example of what you can do if you're really paying attention and trying to optimize pre-hospital trauma care using the right metric, preventable deaths.
So what is the significance of the title of the book?
I will give credit to Dr. O'Connor for that. As we were sorting through the different titles that we could use, he came up with Tell Them Yourself, because if you were a Marine who just got shot, you'd call for the corpsman, and the corpsman would get there, and oftentimes the casualty would say, "Hey, Doc, whatever happens, I want you to tell my family that I love them." And the medic would look at the person and say, "Hey, I got this. You're going to be fine. You're going home to see your family. You can tell them yourself. This is not your day to die." And that was powerful. And there's been a great deal of positive feedback about that title.
Yeah, so just emphasizing that title is Tell Them Yourself is Not Your Day to Die. And speaking of impact, many people talk about how compelling the first chapter of the book is. So we're curious, how did you go about writing that first chapter?
Maybe not you, Don, but Ken and I are old enough to recall when we first read the book Black Hawk Down and first saw the movie Black Hawk Down. It tells about the story of Task Force Ranger in Mogadishu. We were over there on a humanitarian mission and were attacked by warring militia forces in Mogadishu. So what was supposed to be a life-saving humanitarian mission turned into an engagement where we had, I believe it was 18 Americans killed and another 60 or 70 wounded. They were out there in the middle of that city with Somalis shooting at them for 15 hours. It was just an incredible story. And in addition to making for a good book and a good movie, the reason that we put it at the start of the book was so that everybody would have an appreciation for how difficult it is to do what combat medics do. You're trying to take care of your patient, you're trying to survey and see if there are any other casualties. And the whole time, as happened with Bob Mabry, who is sort of the central focus of that first chapter. You're trying to stay alive. You're trying to return fire to the bad guys. So it's an almost impossible situation, and yet that's what our combat medics do. So I figured that it had been long enough that maybe a new generation of Americans needed to be reminded of that combat scenario. And it really does put a very strong focus on the fact that combat medics have to operate in the lethal chaos of the battlefield.
And that was in, I think, 1993.
Yes, 1993.
And a large number of people, as I recall, died from external hemorrhage, like 25 or something, for the lack of a tourniquet in many cases.
There were certainly some that died. And, it's interesting. Where is the preventable death analysis from the casualties in Mogadishu? For that matter, where was the preventable death analysis before John Holcomb went and did his study in 2004 looking at special op fatalities? Our country has not historically done a comprehensive preventable death analysis on its casualties, and it absolutely should. That should be standard protocol, and that's one of the recommendations made in Chapter 30 at the end of the book, where we say, okay, we've learned many of these lessons the hard way. Let's capture the important points and be cognizant of them going forward so that we don't have to learn them again.
Right. In fact, it was a retired Army medic that talked to me about the high percentage of the fatalities in Mogadishu could have been greatly reduced with the availability of tourniquets.
So one of your co-authors on the Tell Them Yourself book is Kevin O'Connor, who's currently the physician to the president. And you were in the Navy and he was in the Army. So can you tell us how you came to know him?
Right. Well, Kevin and I, back before he became a White House physician, knew each other from being in sister, if you will, special operations units. So I'd met Kevin at meetings and various places, and he was interested. He's an innovator. He is a very good personality. He is good at convincing people to do the things that they need to do. So I had worked with him, and he's a wonderful storyteller and made some great contributions to the book in that regard. I loved the story about him being the first person to tell me about TC3 in combat. My son Jeff, our other co-author, the interesting thing about him is that being a SEAL, he got taught TC3. Then when he went into the CIA and was a case officer for 7 years, he got taught TC3 all over again by the medic who was with him in Afghanistan, a special ops icon named Bill Donovan, universally called Doc Donovan. And then again, when he got out of the CIA and moved to Springfield, Missouri, he went into the fire department and he had to learn TC3 again. So he's gotten it from all sides, and I think that's interesting. But he's also the best writer of the three of us. He went to Georgetown, I went to Georgia Tech. What else can you say?
Yeah, engineer versus writer.
Yes, exactly.
So this has been great, Frank. And as we near the end of our discussion, do you have any final comments or insights you'd like to share with us about battlefield trauma care?
I appreciate the opportunity. This book, when we wrote it, fully cognizant of the fact that it was not going to be a bestseller. It's even money as to whether it will even make any money. The reason for writing it was to leave a footprint, to leave a signpost. This is something for the U.S. military to be able to refer back to if we, God forbid, do find ourselves in another war. And it's not enough just for the medical people to know. Congressional leaders need to know about this. We've made an effort to get it to congressmen and senators and their staffs and have succeeded in doing that. But, of course, Congress has been a little bit busy lately, so there's not been any attention at that level. The main thing that book was intended to be is a legacy so that we will not lose anybody else in future wars figuring out all of the things that we learned. Line commanders, combat commanders, the admirals and the generals have to be a big part of it. And, every American service member is willing to give up his or her life for their country, but they count. They absolutely count on military medicine to take as good a care of them as humanly possible if they get injured in battle, and we have to live up to that trust every day.
And Frank, as you well know, we often forget. We in the military side or even the civilian side, we forget hard-won lessons after years of peace. or years of relative peace. There's a lot of lessons that we won in the Cold War that we learned, and we've forgotten some of them, sadly. And I think that's a real value of your book, is that it sort of sits there and stands there as a marker to prevent people forgetting what was very difficult to learn and at a great cost.
The chapter on fluid resuscitation makes the stunning point that we figured out that whole blood was the best thing to use to resuscitate casualties in shock in World War I. Then we forgot it.
Yep.
And then we had to figure it out all over again in World War II. And by the way, a number of people died before we figured it out because they weren't transfused with whole blood when they should have been. And then what did we do after World War II? We forgot it again. When we went to war in Afghanistan and in Iraq, our medics were carrying 20 pounds each worth of electrolyte solution in their packs. That is not good for a casualty in shock, and yet people like John Holcomb and Andre Kapp and Phil Spinella and Geir Strandinas had to lead the way, and we had to invent whole blood as the best. We had to reinvent whole blood as the best resuscitation fluid all over again in Iraq and Afghanistan. We can't afford to do things like that.
Absolutely.
So, Frank, last question for you. We know that you're an avid scuba diver, and I know you and I have talked a lot about different dive trips, and we'd love to know, could you tell us some of your favorite places to go, and then also what else do you enjoy doing in your free time?
So, Don, and it's just too bad that you weren't on some of these dive trips. In fact, I think we may have talked about you being on some of these dive trips. The dive trip that will always stand out in my mind as the ultimate dive experience was Guadalupe Island. We went out with a friend of mine named Ed Stetson, who is a dive organizer and puts together small groups of people. He has a great working relationship with the Nautilus Explorer fleet owned by Mike Lever. And we went out to Guadalupe Island, and for 5 days were suspended off the back of that ship in cages watching dozens of great white sharks swim right by us. You could have reached out literally and touched the great white sharks, and some people did. I decided that I don't write that well left-handed, so I would pass on that opportunity, but it was breathtaking seeing such magnificent animals up so close and in the safety of a cage. So, yes, that was a great dive trip. We're hoping to go to Cocos Island next, which is the Island of the Sharks in that famous movie by Howard and Michelle Hall. So that's an upcoming trip.
Well, that's fantastic, Frank. And we just want to thank you so much for joining us today on STEM Talk. It's been such a great discussion.
It's always a pleasure, Don. Appreciate being with you and Ken.
Yes, thank you, Frank. It was really good.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
So, Ken, today's interview is a reminder that a person on a mission in which they passionately believe can really make a difference. And it's painful to think of all the lives on the battlefield that have been lost in the past 2 centuries because of a bias against tourniquets. And Frank is such a good guy, and it doesn't surprise me at all that he has 5 people in his immediate family who are Navy SEALs, and that's pretty incredible in and of itself.
Yes, it is, Don. I really appreciate how Frank crafted TC3 as an evidence-based guide to best practices for battlefield care. This care has expanded now from the military into civilian life in many ways, and it's now used by emergency medical services and first responders around the world. Frank's book, Tell Them Yourself, is a fascinating read that goes into the history of all of this. I highly recommend this book, and we will include a link in the show notes.
This is Don Cornegas signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.